Welcome back, Shane.
Thank you. Welcome to the podcast, Anton. How's it going?
Man, it is. So let's fucking go now. Yeah, dude,
Yeah,
it's going well. It's been a pretty crazy last week, honestly, dude. It's pretty much talking to the two people that you kind of got me in touch with. It was a interesting moment, to say the least, because one of them I got along super well with, and the other, our energies were almost like oil and water. Like they were very, very different. And it was very interesting for me just to like kind of reflect on that, because I think, in my case, and we kind of talked about this like after just kind of texting, but I think with me, I can sometimes have a tendency of, if someone has accomplished a lot in the world, and if someone is like very spiritually evolved, or they teach these courses and they've done all these things, sometimes I can kind of put them subconsciously on a pedestal, and I can be like, okay, like the way they live life is the correct way of living life. And if for whatever reason we don't resonate perfectly in synchronicity, it's something wrong with me. Like I am kind of, as a human being, there must be something wrong with me, because, well, there can't be anything wrong with them. Or even in like a better way, instead of like wrong with them, just like if we don't resonate, it means that I'm the one who's like not spiritually evolved, or I'm not psychologically evolved. And it was like this last week was really it was a wake-up call for me to realize, like, okay, I can't keep putting people on pedestals, and I can't keep believing that belief, because now, like, when I think about Dr. Craig Wright, who you had on your podcast, and like numerology and astrology and human design, like all of these different systems, like even Myers-Briggs, a psychological test, it's like we've always known about archetypes. We've always known that there's the hero, there's the investigator, there's like all these different things. And it's like when we're in these systems, we are aware that, okay, there's no right way to be. Some people are the hero archetype, other people are the investigator. They might not get along. They have very different kind of missions in life. But it's like, I feel like when we go out into the world, when we interact with people, when we have people on our podcast, when we have meetings in corporate headquarters, as we go out and we interact with human beings in the world, we quickly kind of get into this idea of, if someone doesn't like me, there's a problem with me. And we forget that idea of like, no, people are just their own archetypes. They resonate. And I feel like also, in this like kind of spiritual world, we're always caught up in frequencies. Like, oh, I'm a high vibe person. I have a high vibration. I'm an old fucking soul. Like, you know what I mean? People spew out stuff like that. And you're like, oh, okay, if I interact with an old soul and I'm an old soul, we have to get along. But it's like, even within all of those systems, I feel like we don't just realize that, like, we don't have to get along with everyone. And just because someone has their truth doesn't mean it's a universal truth. You know what I mean, Shane?
Yeah. No, you're right. And it's interesting that you bring that up, because particularly I think in the world today, right, like there's so many people who are clearly espousing different belief systems and ideologies and things like that, whether it's about themselves or others or this or that, and who's right and who's wrong. And it's a complicated question, but in terms of like our relating with one another, it's a very good point, because it's very easy to have a sort of mismatch with someone and kind of blame yourself for it. Because I mean, the way I look at it is, it's like, well, we have these systems trying to identify where the problems are in the world, right? And how we relate to them. And ideally, it's so that we can solve them and move past it and grow. But it doesn't always work super well in our favor, because oftentimes if you can't see an obvious problem, then you're like, okay, well, I must be the problem then. And not to bring it too down, but like this is what happens with kids, right? When they get, into like, when they have like abusive parents or things like that, is automatically blame themselves. Like, I'm being punished because I'm bad, right? And that sort of way of thinking can really get hard grained even without the abuse, like just in terms of how you sort of see yourself in relation to the world, right? It's interesting to sort of talk to you in this position where you're like, okay, well, I've had this experience where I didn't really gel with someone, but now I have enough insight to know that what I was doing wasn't a particularly healthy coping strategy in general, and you know that you're putting people on a pedestal, and yet I bet it still feels like it's still true, at least to a certain degree, right? So you can know that you're doing this wacky thing and still feel it to be true. And it's really hard to change beliefs like that. You know, it takes a lot of practice and a lot of effort.
Yeah, dude. I talk to my mom about this sometimes because this happens all the time. Again, in like these spiritual camps, or even these, like, if you're a psychologist, right? Like you walk around, like you can be like, oh, you know, we're all one, like we're all Zen, like I love everybody. But it's like, then why do you flip off the guy in traffic? Like,
Yeah.
when you actually look at all of our behaviors, how we interact with people every day, it's like everyone who says, like, you know, like I love Ram Dass is one of my favorite dudes right now. I've been researching him a lot lately. But I love that he calls himself on it. Like he's like, oh, I know all this stuff, but I still get, you know, manipulative. I still get angry. I get passive aggressive. And I'm like, thank you, man. Like, thank you for, like, because so many people, when they get to that level, they don't call themselves out anymore as much. They kind of are like, oh yeah, I'm the guru now. I'm the one who has everything in control. But I just love that. Yeah. How, man, like, yeah,
Humanizes himself.
Yeah, it's like anytime you get pissed off or you get defensive, it's like you in that moment, you don't recognize we're all one. Because if you really recognize we're all one in every moment, nothing could piss you off. Because you know that's just another person in another life, in another avatar, another archetype who is doing something in the world that you can't accomplish with your archetype. Like Shane and Anton we're both in podcasting, but I think we're going to touch the world in different ways. Like I have my way of communicating, you have your way of communicating, you have the people you resonate with, and we overlap on that in some way, but there's still kind of differences. And I definitely feel like, yeah, we all kind of need to give each other that benefit of the doubt. And just because, like you said, we know something cognitively doesn't mean we live as if it's true. And the last thing I'll say is I love what you said about parenting. Because that had like a eureka moment in me when you said that, because I'm like, that is probably one of the main issues, is that like we do grow up like being told this is right, this is wrong. When you do something that as the parent they deem wrong, they punish you. So you have like an internal nervous system, like a Pavlov's dogs. Like, you know, they have some food, they get electrocuted. It's like that's what we're like as children. Is like we ask too many questions. That was my thing. I was always the why kid. I ask a million questions about everything. I disproved Santa Claus when I was 5 years old, my mom said, because I asked too many questions. And she's like, I'd ask all these questions, the reindeer, and like, how does Santa, if Santa Claus does this, why can't he do that? And she just finally was like, Santa Claus doesn't exist. And then I was like,
all right, enough questions. Like, Santa's not real. Go to your room.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, exactly. So it's just funny that you mentioned that thing about the parenting, because yeah, I think that is where a lot of this, like, if we don't get along with somebody, we beat ourselves up, because we had two parents who had their archetypes who weren't aware of that. Because we all think we're right. Like, you know what I mean? Like if we get in an argument, you're probably going to be like, yeah, I'm probably right. And then I'm going to be like, I'm probably right. Shane might have a point, but like, yeah, I've lived my life, my entire life. I'm definitely right. And I do feel like a lot of that is from that parenting thing, like you said, you know?
Yeah, but you also kind of have to be right to yourself, right? Because if you couldn't find your opinion about something, it would be so hard to navigate in the world about what you believe to be true. Now, you might be open enough to question your beliefs and change them, but to walk around with total uncertainty, it's not really cool for a human to do that. I mean, maybe some people do, but I think it would, you know, bring a lot of sort of suffering, because it's everything's so uncertain, and we're sort of wired to try and find patterns and then evolve and learn from those and grow and sort of encounter new situations that challenge our old belief systems, and it's not very pleasant, but that's the way life is. And then, you have to incorporate those challenges to overcome them and adapt your belief system sort of along the way, right? To change, to like grow to this new information. But it's interesting the point about parenting, because there doesn't seem to be a way around it, right? In terms of, as humans, as animals, right? You come into the world with perhaps some instincts and things like that, but really you look to your caregivers to teach you about how to survive the world, right? If you look at it from a purely like evolutionary perspective, and they're going to teach you what they know about how they survived, right? And perhaps how they thrived as well, and what they believe to be right. And even if they're not actively trying to do so, children are very good, mimickers, as are young of all kinds. They learn by watching, right? And that's why, you are so often a reflection of your parents. Or actually what happens sometimes too is that you see something, a lot of what you don't want, right? And then you're like, I'm not doing that, right? But then, I mean, you to try and sort of like force it onto your kids, it becomes a different problem. And it's also never ending. There's no ideal parent, right? There's parents who have good days and bad days and teach some good things and some not so good things. And, there really isn't a way around it, because, we're quite limited creatures. Well, you can't transmit all the knowledge of the universe to children, because they just want to, run around and play and have fun and enjoy. They're not trying to evolve their consciousness for most of their, like young childhood and early adolescence. They're just trying to be in the world and interact and relate to people and figure out who they are and what their role is in the world. So it's a very interesting dynamic that sort of comes up. And it's not even necessarily related to, abuse or anything like that. It's just you learn from your parents, because that's how it goes, or from whoever sort of raised you. And then you take that out into the world and, you test out those skills. And if the world has changed, which it is these days, oftentimes old skills are no longer applicable anymore, right? Old belief systems. And you can kind of see that with all the sort of cultural revolutions that are happening basically everywhere, right?
Man, yeah, man, you just said a lot of really interesting stuff. Like there's like three main points. One of which is, like you said, about we need to interact with the world as if we are right about what we believe. To say it simply, like again, you have to have an affirmative, like you have to believe that if you want to go left, you should go left. Like it's, just even that. So that was one thing. Another thing, you're talking about like the human animal, right? And how like instinctually, and how just like any other mammals, we mimic our parents, our caregivers, and we mimic their behaviors. And it just made me think of like the human animal, how we're like half animal, but then we're the only animal, to my recollection, that has the ability for like self-analysis and like self-awareness, and to critique our own thoughts, and to simultaneously live as if everything we do instinctually or intuitively is the right thing to do, but also have a part of our consciousness open to knowing that we have to learn from other people and grow. And it's just a wild thing, because like we're not these purely self-aware beings. Like we're not just these tabula rasa blank slates that can just be like, oh, I want to believe this fully. We, like you said, we have these like mammal monkey impulses, and like, yeah, we just observe the first 7 years of our life, and kind of that becomes who we are for the rest of our life for most people. Like, what they say, I think it was the Roman Catholics, they said, like, give me a boy till the age of the 7, I'll give you a man, something along the lines of that. And it's just like, it is a really wild thing that we are these like two things within one. That's like what a human being is. We're an animal, and we're also this something completely different than an animal. like so different that we can completely change our nature in some way. Like, we haven't fully yet, but just like, uploading our consciousness to computers and like that whole idea is like we're half monkeys and we're half this thing that wants to live forever, defy everything, and understand the laws of the universe. You know what I mean? Like it's wild.
Yeah, dude, being a human is weird. There's no way around it. And the more I sort of think about it, the more I think of us as animals and less of different from monkeys. I saw a thing the other day that said, like, we're really just monkeys with money and power. And the intelligence aspect of it's really interesting, right? Because there's sort of like self-awareness. It comes with a great deal of advantages and disadvantages, right? And you can clearly see this with, like, you just look around and you think that most animals don't live in states of anxiety or depression or existential dread. They don't even fluctuate through those moods most of the time. They kind of exist in this very peaceful way, just going about their thing. I mean, they have challenges and difficulties, obviously, right? They got to find food, they got to survive, they got to protect themselves and their young, and contend with the world. And oftentimes it doesn't end well for them. It ends in, being eaten or starving or freezing or boiling or all kinds of things. But they don't like actively suffer and worry like we do. And that's because we kind of like can sit and focus and ruminate on things because of this sort of extra cognitive ability that we've developed, which allows us for self-reflection, but it also allows us to be incredibly judgmental towards ourselves, right? Because we have this capacity to sit and think about all the things that we've done wrong. Instead of, and I suppose in an ideal context, you would be able to say, okay, these are the things I did wrong. This is what I learned from them. Cool beans. Let's move forwards now, right? But it doesn't really work that way, at least not for anyone I've met, because it's never so simple. And I think a lot of that has to do with like the emotional involvement of those things and how, we're not good emotional regulators, most of us. And it's because it's a skill that's not really taught, and it's because most people don't know it, and that's okay. It's part of the evolutionary process. We're sort of getting there. But it's interesting, to watch like animals in the wild where on one day they'll just be chilling. You have a zebra eating grass, chilling with his family or its crew or whatever, however zebras chill. And then, it'll like almost be killed by a lion, right? And then 10 seconds later, it'll just be eating more grass. It's not worried about it. It doesn't have PTSD, it doesn't have depression or anxiety or anything that comes of it. I mean, those are human problems that we face, and many of us face it. And I'm not saying they're not real problems. Obviously, they are. They are terrible and detrimental and oftentimes end in death one way or another. But it's that extra cognitive ability that seems to facilitate most of this stuff. Right? Don't you think so?
Yeah.
It's a lot.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. That's why it's like people think you have to like immediately when you get a question, like answer it.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, some things are deep and you gotta like,
it's good to think about it.
Empathically kind of think about it. But yeah, it's like when you were speaking, I was almost thinking, it's like, to my recollection, the only species on Earth that can create without instinct. And what I mean by that is, like, I was going to say we're the only thing that can create, but that's not true because beavers create dams and they can alter their environment. But I don't know the inside of a beaver. I don't know if that is purely instinctual. Like, they literally might be like moment to moment. It's like, okay, I have an urge to bite tree, and then like urge to take tree over here, and then urge to let go of tree. And then like I don't know how that creative process works for a beaver creating a dam, but I do know that like human beings, we have this very creative force. Like a lot of, spiritual people will say that that is maybe one of the aspects that makes human beings is that like we can create, we can take from the ether and manifest our thoughts and desires into the world. And then, like, if you have all of these human beings that want to manifest desires into the world, what happens when you put 7 to 8 billion of those human beings on one planet, and then they all want to create the world they have in their minds, but they're all competing with the different worlds that all of us have in our minds. Like, it's like every human being has a desire in the world. And, part of our evolution is getting past the, just because you have a desire doesn't maybe mean it is the desire that the world needs completely. It's almost like we go from this very individualized creation or identity where it's about me, and then I learn about myself, I create in the world, I interact and I meet other people, and then through our interaction you learn that we both have our kind of ideas. And then I don't know, it's like maybe the human animal, like that's evolution, is like just learning to kind of, in some sense, in a weird way, like compromise and maybe even almost like create like a hive mind. You know what I mean?
Well, it's interesting because, the separation between individual and collective conscious isn't entirely clear, right? Where what's real now, you might be confused about what's best for you, or you might not know exactly what's best for you. You might think right? But really, they're just ideas that you have, and you don't know all the implications of it. Like you dream to have, I don't know, all this money, right? But you don't foresee all of the negative sides of that, because there's a polarity to everything. And then all of a sudden you have all this money, you don't know what to do with it. You don't know how to handle it. You don't know how to handle people wanting everything from you. You don't know how to navigate that whole system. And then, potentially other fears and anxieties come up, like what happens if you lose all of it, or if you make bad investments, or if you, run out, or all of these things that might come up, that you don't foresee, but you kind of you hold on to that one image of like, it would be cool to have all this money because then I don't have to worry about doing anything or working or anything like that. And that is true, but it's not the whole truth, right? And that's why, it's not why, but it's at least partly why they say like most people who win the lottery go broke in like 5 to 10 years or something like that, right? Is because the money itself is only one thing, right? A whole host of factors have to come into play for that to really enrich, your whole experience. And so but the point I was making was that, like, really, when you're sort of like dealing with any individual person, it's kind of like the best version of you is also going to be best for everyone else, right? And they might not know that at the time, the other people, but that's what everyone wants for each other. We just can't do it for each other. You can only really do it for yourself, right? And so that creation is interesting because we do seem to want to move towards these like collective conscious experiences and existences, and yet we don't have alignment on what that is. And so when we try to do that, it usually ends quite badly. Communism and the like, that's always been a fun one. But it is interesting to figure out, like, how do I fit in the world as myself and the best version of myself that's also great for everyone else, right?
Yeah. It's funny. I just had like a thought. Have you ever seen the show Manifest?
No.
I think you'd love that show. I'm watching it right now. It's essentially the synopsis, and it actually goes right into your idea. So there's this plane that is leaving from Jamaica, going back to America, right? Going back to Los Angeles. And what happens is like one of the planes, they reach full capacity, and they end up saying like, okay, if some of the people here want to go on the next plane, we'll pay you $400. So some people, they end up going on the next plane. Now, what happens is in the second plane, when that touches down in Los Angeles, they're met by the FBI and the paramilitary, right? Or just military. And they realize that they've been gone for 5 years. So they thought they took a 5-hour flight back, but they're actually gone for 5 years. And what happens, and this is not really spoilers, this all happens in the first episode. But what happens is when they come back, they realize that they have these like weird kind of powers. Everyone who's on that second flight that was gone for 5 years, they're getting what they call callings. They're getting these messages, and they don't know where they're from, but they're all getting the same one. They're all getting them, and they think, some atheists start to believe in God, and some, religious people think it's God speaking to them. But the reason why I mention this is over the next few episodes, what happens is all of these people that usually had these individual consciousnesses that only would think about their lives, their family, their tomorrows, all of a sudden they are connected like a hive mind. And they're all getting kind of these same downloads, and they don't know where they're getting them from, but they're getting these like downloads, these intuitions to do things in the world, to save people. They're getting pieces of information like go to this warehouse, and they'll go to the warehouse and they'll be like kidnap children. And they'll like, and so it's really interesting. And the reason why I mention this is it's like, I kind of see that personally as a metaphor for intuition, as a metaphor for listening to your higher self. And the only kind of, in some sense, way, it's not the only way, but one way I think, because, I'm quite a spiritual person. And I think that, part of the human evolutionary pattern is something to do with consciousness and this like kind of deepening of the intuition, deepening of the heart, and just the more connectedness. And you can feel that as you develop as a human being, you become more empathic to other human beings. You feel people's vibrations more. If you're, quiet and silent, you can feel and intuit people. And maybe kind of potentially where we're going in some sense is like, again, like people like Ram Dass or any psychic or anyone who's really intuitive and has got in touch with their intuition, they will always say the same thing, that they feel led and compelled to certain things by their intuition. They'll look at a flyer for a vacation and they'll just like have this burning thing beyond logic, like you have to go there, and they don't know why. And so potentially, I don't know, but maybe that's kind of what was going to happen to us as a human species if we all get emotionally regulated and we all kind of develop into who we are here to be. And I'm thinking maybe there is like a governing principle, almost like a mathematical equation. I, at the moment, don't know if it's like conscious, like if it's a God that's issuing orders because there's a grand plan. But it almost seems like a natural organizational principle, like chaos theory, that things like, like resonances attract and unlike resonances repel. Like that seems like mathematical. It just seems like a natural organizing principle. And I think that possibly, in some sense, maybe not, it might be where we are heading. What do you think about something like that?
Yeah, I think it's an that's just a coughing today. It's an interesting idea. I think that what we tend to do is as humans, we tend to be so focused on our individual lives and experience, right? And that's just because that's just sort of natural to us at this point in time. It's not a criticism. It's just sort of how it is. And, a lot of the time we view ourselves as isolated from the rest of existence, right? And even though some part of you might recognize that, there is unity to all of existence, it certainly feels like there isn't most of the time. I mean, we feel ourselves to be separate, right? And, things in the world are separate from us, and we can do things and change things and, interact, and most of it's not in our control, but some of it is. And, but the point about that is like, well, it's more complicated than that, because we're so interconnected with everyone else and with the whole world and with the universe in a much grander sense, because we don't exist without it, right? I mean, if you just look at how dependent we are on our environment, we don't think we are, but really, we live in a time where, we exist the way we do because of our environment being the way it is, and we evolved to breathe the air of the atmosphere that exists right now, right? We need the food that's available to us that comes from the earth or from other animals or whatever it is, right? So you can't escape that. And, from a social perspective, I mean, most people probably wouldn't survive very long by themselves, from a, at least from like an emotional perspective. I mean, some people could, I suppose, but rarely, back in the day, one of the worst punishments for you to be banished from your tribe or your crew or whatever it is. And it was basically a death sentence, right? Because even if you could survive the elements, the lack of social connectivity, most people go insane. And that's why today, the worst punishment really that we can that we can do to each other is solitary confinement, right? In prisons. That's seen as like the most severe of the punishments, is to lock people away with no contact to anyone else. And we're so dependent on the sun and just so many things, right? And, we think of ourselves as whole beings that don't change very much, but really, like our cells are constantly changing and, interacting, and we're different versions we're different physical structures year after year. It all changes, and it's all interacting with the environment. And, we have millions of tiny little bacteria and things like that exist on us and in us, and, in these sort of dynamic relationships to each other. And so we're so connected, and yet we often feel so disconnected, right?
Yeah.
And that's not even like a social point of like feeling disconnected from each other. It's just we don't see ourselves as part of this whole thing. But really, just from if you take like a physics perspective, you can just look at the universe as an entity and say, well, there's just one, right? It's a totality of things, and all of the atoms or the constituents that make up everything in the universe are just flowing into each other and changing forms, right? And we see it mostly in nature and things like that, where you plant like a little acorn, and a monstrous tree grows just seemingly out of nowhere, just using the earth and the sun and the rain and all that kind of stuff. And then something happens and it dies, and then it becomes food for something else, right? And it's this like magical connectivity that we often just feel ourselves so disconnected from. And I'm not really sure why that is, but it's certainly a common experience. And I think, COVID's made that a lot worse for us. But nevertheless, maybe it's a lesson to be learned, that when you take away, the good things in your life, you learn to appreciate them a lot more, right? I don't know. It's very strange being a human.
Yeah, and by the way, if you saw me like on my phone, I was writing down some of the ideas you had.
Oh, yeah.
I wasn't being an asshole. I was like, I hope Shane has talked to me enough to be like, yeah. I don't think he's just texting somebody in the middle of a podcast.
No.
But
I
yeah,
figured you were doing something important. Yeah.
Very important. And because you said like we're all connected. I had like kind of 4 ideas from that. Like one thing they say is like if you get a whole bunch of females on if you get them together for a long period of time, their I think it's their menstrual cycles will start to sync up. So that alone is interesting. Again, that's not, they're not trying to do that. That is literally just part of a natural process that we, without our knowing, we adapt our biology to reflect the people around us. And so that right there kind of proves your point, is that we literally change an aspect of our humanity, our biology, based on what's around us. We're a social species.
It's a very good point. That.
Yeah, and then like you see, we're talking about bacteria, which I wish we had a Jamie. This is what I'll say. Like Joe Rogan, like this is what I always think. Like, because I might misspeak, and then I wish I had someone who's just like typing in everything I said. Yeah. But I think I've heard it said that a human being, and let me know if you've heard something like this in your perspective, that a human being is, I think we're like more bacteria than anything else. It was something like the human animal. If you actually like look at our cells and everything, like we're a majority of what we're made up of is a alien entity outside of the human that has a symbiotic relationship with humans. And if you think about even like a human, what is a human? Yeah. Like, you know, I'm talking to Shane, and I think I know who I'm. Like, you have a face, you have a body, those like when I look through your eyes, I'm seeing Shane. Like, that's the way that we just subconsciously interact with human beings. Like, that whole thing that I'm looking at is Shane. But you are literally trillions and trillions of cells, and your eyes are a collection of different cells making up the eyeball. And then in between your eye cells are nose cells and skin cells and hair cells. And like, you're like, what is Shane?
Yeah.
You know, he is, and then he has, like I said, all this bacteria that symbiotically interacts with those different cells, and they interact and they cohabitate. And then there's this weird thing called consciousness. And when I'm interacting with the trillions of cells, somehow all of those trillion cells can agree on a shared story, a shared consciousness, a shared state, so that I can interact with a trillion different things and somehow have a unified conversation with a trillion different parts of something. Yeah. That when they come together, they create Shane. Like, just like, that's mind-boggling. You know what I mean?
And even it's so crazy, and we have no idea what that consciousness really is from a scientific perspective. I mean, there's some theories about it, and you know, that it's epiphenomenal or whatever it is, but nevertheless, we don't have a good answer. Otherwise, it would be known, like widely known, that this is what it is. So I'm not saying they're wrong, but you know, maybe it's just not a full picture yet. But it's also cool that like the whole human comes from a single cell, and that every piece of information that's needed to create every part of you came from 2 strands of DNA. But a double helix. I don't know if it's 1 or 2 technically. I think it's 2. But all of that is in this incredibly small thing that we can't even see with, you know, the naked eye. And that just naturally, by some principle, evolves into an entire person and continues to do so, you know, until it doesn't. And then there's death. But yeah, and it's weird like how we interact with each other, and you know, looking into people's eyes is a really strange like experience, because it's 2 emptinesses connecting, because your eyes actually mostly take in light and information, right? Some of it's reflected, and that's why we can see eyeballs and things like that, and it's all like processed in the brain and whatever it is. But so it is really weird to make eye contact with someone because nothing's really happening. I mean, there's just this like social almost understanding of connection when that happens. I don't really know why. I've never thought about it that way. Do you have any ideas?
Yeah, I have a few thoughts. I don't know if I wish I could just sit here and answer your question about the universe. I wish I was that smart.
Maybe one day.
Maybe. Yeah, Anton will be the next Ram Dass. That's what I'll be. Yeah. But yeah, it is weird because all of these spiritual people say that the eyes are the window to the soul. And based on what you just said, the eyes are like this like kind of vacant, like they just kind of take in light. But when you do look into like someone's eyes, it is like a transfer of energy, because you can like calm someone's nervous system. People are terrified of looking you in the eyes when they lie to you. People, if they're feeling down, like I'm like this, if I'm having a bad day and I'm beating myself up, I do not want to look anybody in the eyes, because that somehow is too vulnerable. I would rather touch a human being on the arm and make physical contact. That is easier than looking into somebody's empty abyss of the eyes. That is a weird thing. It's like, yeah, we're looking into nothing, but our whole being, it's like, that is like the most important thing. That is like the deepest kind of connection in some sense. It's like eye contact. And if you talk to me in this podcast and you are looking at my face on your computer, I don't feel like we are connecting the same way I do when I'm looking into your eyes. There's literally a different physiological and conscious awareness shift when I look into your eyes. I feel like in that moment you see me, and even see you. That's really when I'm saying you see me, I'm really saying you feel me, you get me, you take on my energy, you resonate with me. We're like two polarities that are merging through, like you said, a response that is nothing more than kind of like photons.
It's very weird. But I think that you touched on the point about vulnerability, which I think is certainly one of the essential components to it, because eye contact is used for all kinds of things, right? It can even be used in the opposite, to assert dominance, right? And that's a different situation as well. But I suppose it's also not just eye contact, right? There's more to it. It's just the eye contact is kind of the main connecting point that everything else sort of fits into it, Because if someone's kind of like coming at you with a weapon, eye contact's, not really going to do much for you. I guess what you do get to see is you get to, in some way, take in their energy, as you say. So if they're filled with rage, you can see that in people's eyes, right? And it would be interesting to see if you like just took a little shot of like just eyes, and see how much emotion you could tell from that. And you could probably tell quite a lot. And it also has to do with, I suppose, the muscles and the tissue around your eyes. And, like when you smile, like your eyes tend to go smaller and the corners tilt up, and, anger is much more like wide-eyed to take in a lot more of the information and all kinds of things like that. And we just know that intuitively, right? We don't know it, but we feel the response. And you can see this with babies and children, right? If you pull a funny face to a baby, it's either going to laugh or cry, but it's responding just by looking at you, right? There's no necessary other interactions. And so it makes sense that like when we're not feeling good, we don't want to connect with other people because it feels too vulnerable. And it's very strange. I think this whole episode's about how weird it is to be a human. That's really the pinnacle point of it, Everything's weird.
I think that's the title we're going to use for it, for sure. Yeah. Like, just how weird is it to be a human? But then you had another really interesting point too. You were saying how with human beings, everything we become is all stored within a single cell, the DNA, right? And then when you said that, I looked over to my computer and I thought, we're a really magnificent piece of hardware and architecture, because we're the equivalent of you buying like a chip, or actually a better example is like Transformers, like you buying a chip that like over a week like expands and opens and morphs into your computer. And it's like, is that like, do you remember, you're about the same age as me. Do you remember those things that we used to buy as children where they would be like in a capsule or something? They'd be like a sponge or a foam thing. You put them in water and they grow and evolve into like a picture
an
of
animal.
It's kind of like that. Like we're kind of like that. And like, well, it's kind of like, I guess, like 3D printing. is like we'll probably get to a point where rather than buying a computer, you buy like this like tiny capsule, and then you like put the tiny capsule on a surface, and it just starts to grow and evolve and morph. Or even, dude, imagine doing that with a house, bro.
Yeah, that would be cool.
Like a folded thing, and then like you literally like not water it, but like just you like press a button, you chuck it like a Pokemon thing, and then like it just opens, and like you watch it for like a week literally grow into a house. Like that's what we are, though. That's what a human being is. We're like a Pokeball that turns into like this like thing, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it is what we are. And we're amazing machines, if that's even the right word, because we're built to adapt to anything that happens just about in our environment, right? Anything that happens, your body will almost certainly adapt to it. And we're remarkably sturdy and yet simultaneously very fragile. I mean, you know, we can take massive beatings and withstand tremendous amounts of stress and pressure, and yet a tiny little blade, you know, leaks all the fluid out, and that's the end of you. Or a bullet, it's a little more intense, but, you know, or, I mean, it's crazy. And we're almost perfect instruments for the environment that we live in. And, you know, it probably wouldn't be that way if we go somewhere else. It would have to adapt to a completely new way of being. That's why, like, I mean, dude, astronauts who go to space for extended periods of time have a rough time when they come back to Earth. It's rough. It wrecks the body being in space because it's not designed for that. We're designed to be here with this amount of gravity in this atmosphere, with this amount of exposure to the sun and oxygen and each other and animals and things like that. But it's absolutely brilliant. And what's even more brilliant is how we can heal ourselves, right? Not always, but very often. You know, when you get a small cut on your body, you just know that it's going to heal. I mean, I have no idea how that happens. And even if I knew the technical details of it, that doesn't really explain it, right? An explanation in terms of feedback loops isn't really sufficient for me, because it's all, I mean, maybe it is for some people, but it's all so, I mean, magical is really the right word, how it works, right? And how much we can actually influence our own existence through that kind of method.
Yeah, it is so weird, man. Because I was thinking like back to like the inception of like DNA and the like self-modifying cells. And I'm thinking like, well, my computer is made out of the elements of the earth, yet my computer doesn't have consciousness and it can't rebuild itself. And if I accidentally chip a corner of my PC, it doesn't just recreate itself, but like it's made of something from the earth, and we're made of something from the earth, and we're made of stardust. And like, yeah, human, like if you almost don't distinguish the difference between living animals and computers, or the things that we create, if you think of like a shared DNA tree, like a computer is like a cousin of the human being. Like if you don't be like, oh yeah, computer's something else, and living life is here. If you like kind of, they're like, we're cousins. It's like, it's just bonkers. Like, yeah, how we came from this like single-celled organism. Like, where did that come from? How did that, like, how does stardust create a single-celled organism that creates a multi-celled organism that creates a monkey that creates human beings that can create virtual reality worlds and plug in their consciousness and live forever? Like I'm like, that's bonkers. You know what I mean? Man.
I mean, I think about that shit and I'm like, how can you not believe in something greater than just us? And or that it's all accidental. I mean, what does accidental even mean, dude? Like, what is an accident? It's something that, or chance or random events. It's like, well, what that means is it just doesn't have an explanation. But is it because we don't know the explanation or because there isn't one? And I don't know. There's no real answer to that question. That's already problematic situation for a lot of people. But to me, that just thinking about those kind of things just makes me think about how extraordinary everything is, and how could it possibly be just random events in space, right? Like, I mean, I guess it's possible, obviously, because I don't know the answer, so I can't say it can't be this or it can't be that, but it's also just, it's too crazy and complicated and perfect for it to seemingly be just an accident, right?
Yeah. And at the same time, like there's some people, and these are, again, these different archetypes. There's some people that are like, dude, Shane and Anton, you guys are wasting your time talking about things that you can't prove. And I'm like, well,
what are you talking about?
Yeah. Well, I'm also thinking, I'm like, well, if you look at like authors, right? Like, what is a story?
Yeah.
If someone went, what if? Like, you get like Neil Gaiman or Stephen King or Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings. Like, you just get the craziest books. And you're like, that literally started from a similar idea of like us contemplating shit we don't understand. It's like people are like, it's fun to just think about things. Like, that's what I learned from Joe Rogan. Listen to him, is like when he just starts randomly talking about crazy, stupid stuff. I'm like, yeah. I feel like just the process of thinking about things you normally don't think about that are inherently mysterious and creative. I think that is the spark that has us create all these Marvel movies and all these comic books and all these stories. It's like, it comes from the same thing. It comes from people that are thinking about things that don't matter.
Yeah.
Like, like how can you, like, someone could say the same thing to Neil Gaiman, or who's your favorite author of fiction?
That's a hard question. I'm not a huge fiction fan, but let's just say J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter for the sake of argument.
Yeah. Someone could be like, oh, J.K. Rowling, why are you thinking about nerds going to wizard school?
Yeah.
Like, you could be like that. It's like, well, because it rocks, because it became like one of the best selling book series and movie series of all time, because it inspired people to dream and like,
and mostly because it was fun for her to do that, right? The creativity process in its essence is best when it's best for the person doing it. Right. In fact, I did a whole episode on this on a podcast with a guy named Dave Stevens, and we had this amazing discussion about how important creativity is, and how the way that the world kind of works for most people is that we don't allow ourselves to express our creative, influences or expressions, because we feel like we're wasting time, or it's silly, or it's childish, or what's the point, or it won't amount to anything, because as if everything has to amount to something or give some sort of return, and that we don't engage in these practices just for the sake of the practice because it's fun and enjoyable. And how many people have a creative outlet of sort, whether it's music, art, writing. I mean, it could be anything. It could be running, walking, parkour, like all these kinds of things. Whatever makes you feel good in a way that you go into it and you get into the zone where you don't know what's going to happen, but you just allow life to flow through you in that moment, in whatever form it takes, whatever thoughts come up, whatever brush strokes you want to do, I don't know, or whatever storylines you want to add. And unbelievable things come out of it. I mean, to think about, like, if we take the Harry Potter example, to think about the amount of detail and perfectly constructed archetypal stories that exist in that universe, it's hard to imagine how that just came out of one person's head. It's remarkable. And whether it's Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings or any of them, or the Marvel universe, I mean, Stan Lee, like, what a genius. Right? It's just unimaginable how that comes about, until you kind of take a step back and say, well, he allowed himself to do that and to be creative and to enjoy the process and to live in his imagination and see what comes out of it without having to think of all the potential repercussions of it,
Yeah.
And
yeah,
it's just
like,
free.
Go on.
No, just free flow expression. you know?
Yeah, it's well, it's interesting because like yeah, J.K. Rowling, J.R. Tolkien, all these authors and stuff, like they're, I think we always kind of think of like, oh, they're creating something outside of reality, or they're creating like a story, and a story doesn't exist and it's not real. But she's created people. She's created life forms that
Yeah.
have backstories, and somehow all of it makes sense. Like I don't think of Dumbledore or Harry and go, oh, that that is not a real human being. Like there's never once where I just go, nope, that's fake. Like that would never happen to that. Like somehow, like in a weird way, all authors are master psychologists because somehow they recreate life. They recreate people with coherent backgrounds and coherent traumas and coherent. And obviously, some authors don't do this as well, but the best of the best, like they create human beings. Like they raise babies, they raise children through these stories, and they see them till the end in some weird way that never makes us aware of what they're even doing. Like we're so engrossed in the reality, the fiction they've created.
Yeah.
And it's just like sometimes I read Stephen King because I feel he's one of the best at this. And I read him and I'm like, this dude's like a psychologist. Like no one gives Stephen King credit as a psychologist. The
you
way
go for it. Give him credit.
Yeah, exactly.
Shout out to Stephen King. If you're listening to this podcast, you deserve more credit, buddy.
Yeah, Stephen, come on my podcast and talk to me. I'm going to give you credit for being smart.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like, man, like I read some of his books and I'm like, this dude's a genius. Like how he can get into the psyche and how he can understand traumas and pain and cause and effect. And it's like, I don't know if he ever studied psychology. I don't know if he did a master's and a PhD, but dare I say he might be more.
Even if he did, that's not what they teach you.
Yeah. I'm like, how does he do that? Like it's just wild. And then you have this idea of like, did Stan Lee create Marvel, or was Marvel channeled through Stan Lee? Like that's the question for me, is like, where do ideas come from?
Yeah.
Do we create these things? Because like there's an author, Alan Moore, he's a famous comic author. He wrote V for Vendetta, he wrote Swamp Thing, he wrote Watchmen, like a lot of these Hollywood blockbusters, he was behind writing them. And he said, he's like, I don't create these stories flow through me like they're entities from other dimensions. Like I am a channel and I just channel these ideas. And then you've heard Buddhists and you've heard, the ancients talking about this all the time, that we're just channels. We're just intuitively speaking what comes to us. Like even when we think about the thought process, me talking to you right now, what am I doing? I think I'm creating words, but they're kind of coming pretty quick. Yeah. And like everything is like a cyclone. And I don't really feel like I'm choosing my words. I feel like they're just coming through me. And so when you even think about the thought process, it's almost like what you said about was it the universe, or if there's a creator, or if the creator's conscious. Even thoughts, like we when we're meditating, we go, oh, thoughts are like clouds and they drift across, but it's like, okay, but where did the clouds come from?
Yeah.
Like are they really just these things that come from our experiences? Are they all from our experiences? Are some of them from other people's experiences? Because then you even have the heart, where if someone gets a heart transplant, apparently the heart has memory cells and can have the memories of other human beings stored within it. So then you think, okay, if I get a heart transplant and I get other people's memories, because people have been able to solve crimes that have led to the death of who gave up their heart.
Hey,
they've been,
really?
That's been, 100%. Greg Braden talks about it. There was a little girl, and she gave her heart. She died. She was murdered. And they gave her heart to another little girl, I think. And that little girl helped the cops draw the face of the man who killed the previous owner of the heart.
Jeez.
So that's mind blowing. She was able to literally draw the face and talk about how the other person died. So
That's
then it's
mental.
like, okay, that was a thought that she communicated to a police officer. A thought. Okay, so where do thoughts come from? Where are thoughts stored? Where are thoughts created? You know what I mean?
Dude, that's a wild story.
let's just stop and think about how freaking wild that is.
That sounds more like fiction than Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings. Oh, it sounds as much fictional as that. But I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying.
I know, it sounds insane.
It sounds, and there's so many stories of crazy shit like that. But your point about where do thoughts come from and is it channeling is a good point. And I think it comes to part of it is your experience of it, right? Like in normal conversation, like as you were saying, like I'm not thinking about what I'm going to say next, like right now as I'm speaking. It's just coming. But I trust that it's communicating what is happening somewhere inside or wherever. And I don't know how that works, right? And I think that it probably becomes particularly highlighted or exacerbated when people do it intentionally. So where they'll sit or stand, this position's irrelevant, in a way where they're like, I'm waiting for inspiration to come through me, right? And then that probably can be perceived a lot more as if it's not coming from you, it's coming from somewhere else, or it's coming from deep within you. These are all kind of like metaphors because it's not exactly clear what we're talking about. And that probably feels a lot more like channeling than something like a real life conversation. Although to me, it seems like it's pretty much the same thing. It's sort of a spectrum occurrence, right? And I don't know the answer. It's a very good question. And it's interesting when you see like the neuroscience side of things where they say like actually thoughts happen in your head before you become conscious of them, particularly with decision making, right? So something gets decided inside of you, where and why that happens is complicated, but something makes that decision, and then it gets brought to your awareness, and then you feel like you're making the decision. But did you really make that decision? And there's no good answer to that. I mean, there's opinions about it. I don't know where I stand. I've thought about it, and it's too out there to have a firm view for me either way, because I'm just like, I don't know. I've experienced it, but I don't, what do you even say to that? Like, I don't know. I mean, I don't know why I'm saying the things I'm saying right now, which sounds mental to say, right? But that is the truth of the experience, right? And yet at the same time, it feels like I am saying it, whatever that means. It feels like it's me. I'm speaking. And these are my thoughts and my ideas. And maybe I got them from other people and from interactions and from learning and from self-analysis and reflections. And, it's sort of developed that way. And that's true. And it still feels like me, but I don't know where it's coming from or why I'm saying this right now. Here's a good example. Chocolate. Why did that happen? And now I'll be honest. I didn't know what I was going to say when I brought that example up. I just thought, I'm going to see what comes to mind. And it was just chocolate. And that was probably because of the decision-making thing. And I was thinking about chocolate and vanilla kind of things. But it's still, it's a good question. I don't know, dude. This is a really hard question, but very interesting, Yeah,
we're having the best podcast about nothing I've ever had.
Fuck yeah, man. And this is what it's about, No real points have been made. What points have we made? Just that humans are fucking weird. And it's cool and fun to think about it sometimes.
Well, I also think it's like important not to discount the importance of these kinds of conversations, because if you think about depression, if you think about, just the boredom, the apathy of life, I sometimes feel like if you don't ever get out of the box, if you don't ever be goofy, be wacky, dance for no reason, just start being a kid, it's like I almost feel like your imagination, your creativity gets like solidified into like a rock. And you sometimes see people like, we've all talked to people and they're like 50s, their 40s, some people in their 20s already,
Mm.
where you have conversation unless like they're unable to get outside of a certain rhythm of communication, of a certain way of thinking. It's like they can't go a bit to the left or the right. They're just on one track, and then usually this solidifies over the course of life. It's like as children, you're thinking about crazy shit, and you're running around, and you have made up friends, and you have all this stuff, and you believe in Santa Claus. And then it's like over the course of your life, the things you allow yourself to think about and comprehend gets minimalized until you're like a 60-year-old man who's bored of life, and just kind of that fire, that creativity inside of him is just dead. And you talk to some people like that, and there's just no beating heart. There's just no enthusiasm in some sense. I feel like these conversations, these like, whoa, dude, what if this is insane? Even if it doesn't go anywhere, it's like I feel like it keeps that creativity elastic. It keeps it buoyant. It keeps it, if you stop having wild conversations, it's like, maybe your ability to think outside of the box shrinks. Maybe the more you have crazy like conversations like this, maybe I'll end up writing a fiction book in 10 years. And maybe I wouldn't if I just went, no, I'm not going to think about anything that is not something I can directly control. It's like, I think it's difficult to know the importance of outside of the box thinking and just dreaming. Like, we live in a society that's kind of like anti-dreaming. Don't dream about things you can't control. Don't dream about things for the sake of dreaming about them. Like, we have a lot of rules and constrictions on what it is to be a human being in our society. You know what I mean?
Well, it's weird because I think that we live in a very strange society where on the one hand, there's very much a sense of like, follow your dreams, right? But oftentimes that gets cut or diverted into realism, right? And like, but what's realistic for you, right? Is it going to get you a job? Is it going to make you money? And these are all valid concerns. I'm not saying that they're, should be dismissed, and, you should do things intelligently and work towards your dreams in a smart way. It's not just about, fuck everything, whatever. But we also, I think that with the advent of the internet, creativity has blossomed for so many people in so many different ways, right? And you see this with all the little communities that exist online in basically every aspect of human existence that you can imagine. There's a community online who are out there talking about it and sharing ideas and, doing all what we've talked about, just letting themselves have fun and indulge and be a part of something else and creative, whether it's, fandom or cosplay or this podcast or that podcast or, fictional stories or like murder mystery or whatever. I mean, as far as you can think, there's stuff online about it, or like dog, dressing your dogs up, or dude, I don't know. I'm trying to think of like wild examples, but that's as much as I can get. But whatever you think of, there's a cushion community, I bet you, of like who has the best cushions, who quilts the best, like sewing techniques, like anything you can imagine. There's people out there who are forming these little communities and just having fun and expressing these ideas. And some people, I suppose, benefit more than others in those communities. And okay, it's not really pertinent to this conversation, but so I think it's interesting that we simultaneously, and also I think it's interesting, these virtual worlds that are being created are very interesting opportunities for that, right? Because you get to escape reality in a much more real sense than we are right now with social media. And I think it's a good thing, and I think it'll be a bad thing for obvious reasons. But really in those worlds, you could have what you perceive to be the most boring job and life that you can imagine. And whatever that looks like for you, so be it. And yet, when you come home after work, you put on your VR stuff and you're basically in another universe where you get to be a different person with a different life. Now, it's not the same, to be fair. And it's probably not a good substitute for reality, but it is an interesting expression of creativity. And you see that already with online gaming, right? People spend hours and hours of their days just gaming online with communities to support them and each other. And it's fun and it's great. And okay, sometimes there are consequences and, you know, addictions happen and things like that, but that's true in general. But the point being that, like, it's just amazing what's available these days, you know, and navigating that's really the challenge of finding the balance for yourself as an individual.
Yeah, it's almost like we're finally at the place where the ability to manifest has caught up with our imaginations.
Yeah.
Like if you think about Neanderthals or something, their ability to manifest the ideas in their minds, like they weren't able to manifest at the speed of which they had ideas. And we're entering a world where we're getting faster and faster and faster at the ability to create. Especially with the, like you said, virtual worlds. We're suddenly thrust in the idea where any idea I have, I can create in a virtual world. Do I want to create a house? Do I want to create a book? Do I want to have this experience, that experience, go to a concert? It's like it's just kind of wild. And that is the last thing. I know you have to get going and do your essay in about 5 minutes. So yeah, man, any last thoughts on the crazy wackiness of creativity and imagination before we finish up?
No, dude, it's been an absolute pleasure. It's been fun. We've covered a lot of things, nothing of substance, one might say. And yet at the same time, it was just the best. And this is what podcasting is very much about for me. And, you know, it was great. And I'm sure we'll do a lot more. So thank you very much. Oh, people should check out your podcast, right? Arc Vision podcast and Arc Vision Creations on YouTube for your reaction videos. That's worth a good watch. And yeah, man, thank you. What else would you like to promote? Sorry, I suppose I should turn that to you.
Yeah. Shane is a brilliant researcher to the point where he doesn't even know my YouTube channel name. It's Arc Vision Reactions, not Creations.
Oh, not Creations.
I was just gonna let you go with it, but I'm like, nah, I'm gonna throw him on the spot.
My apologies.
Dude, I don't care, man. It's like everyone has brain farts, man.
Dude, the other day I introduced a guest by the wrong name.
Dude, and it's like, man, some people get so pissed off. They're like, how dare you not know my name? I'm like, we're human, man. Like, that's why I find it this interesting. Like I said about podcasting, like taking people too seriously and
it's all just fun.
It's fucking being a dumb human being. Like I said, being a human being is absolutely insane. Don't take it too seriously.
Yeah.
Like,
to be fair,
if you get.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say, to be fair, I didn't introduce someone as like the wrong person. It was just a bad pronunciation of their name. I wasn't like, oh, you know, today's Billy. And they were like, no, I'm not Billy. My name's Jake. It's like, no. It was just a mispronunciation, but she took it wonderfully and it made a good start to the episode because it's fun, as you're saying, right? It's all about just enjoying and not being too serious and not being offended. And, you know, just relate to people, you know, just enjoy your life.
I know, like literally, man, if you in the next podcast acts like, because the thing is, like, as long as I know you have good intentions, like as long as like if me and Shane are talking for a month and he's like, hey Anton, I'm excited for the podcast, and for some reason when we go on the next podcast you're like, and I have with me like Richard Czachor, I'd probably just laugh my ass off, and I feel like, dude, what the hell is going on with you right now? Because it's like, man, I think people take life way too seriously. I think people are just, and I think a lot of it, it comes from like childhood. And like, you know, maybe in high school, they weren't popular and people made fun of them and they weren't taken seriously. And now they're a PhD person and they're like, it's just so funny when I
take me seriously.
I was like, I talked to Craig Wright and I was like, so how do you want me to introduce you? Like Dr. Craig Wright, Dr. Wright. And he's like, just call me Dr. Craig. I was like, okay, so like half informal, half formal. It's like Dr. Craig, like, and it was just like, it was tongue in cheek. It was hilarious. And I was like, that's it, man. Like you're having fun with it. You're like, yeah, I'm a doctor. I've worked pretty hard at this, but you're not so like rigid that you're like, oh, you need to call me Dr. Wright. Like, I just love that. So,
and also if you called him just Craig, he'd probably be like, yeah, that's cool too. You know, he's such a chill dude. By the way, he called me Sean for most of the podcast.
Dude, exactly.
But many people do, so I tend to just let it go. And I know he wasn't doing it on purpose. It's just, for some reason, that's people's automatic go-to name, is they just go Sean. And I'm like, yeah, all right. It's not serious.
Dude, yeah. I think that people, and this is one thing I find about our culture nowadays, is I think people, we're getting intentionality and outcome really mixed up. Yeah. Where if someone says the wrong thing, they're canceled, but we never even inquire into what did they try to say? What was their intention? Did they try to hurt that person?
Yeah.
Like, we live in this, like, yeah, this kind of cancel culture in some sense, where we don't really care about getting to know people that we've kind of thrown under the bus. We're just like, oh, you've done the wrong thing.
Yeah.
And it's like, as we talked about at the beginning of this podcast, we're all doing the wrong thing because there's no right way to do anything. We're all different. We're all different archetypes. We're all different. We all look at the same kernel of truth from different perspectives.
Yeah.
And so we just have this absolute truth way of looking at the world right now that I think is getting us into a lot of trouble, because it's not what we intend. It's not what we want to do to other human beings. It's what do we end up doing? And it's like, I don't think that's fair for anybody. Again, if you mess up my name, but you value my humanity, why would I get mad? Your intention was to connect with me, and you still are. Even if you mess up my name, you're still connecting with me. You're still, like, you know what I mean? It
adds a nice layer to it, you know? Because now it will be like, yeah, all right, cool. Because now I bet you from here on out, I'm going to call it Arc Vision Creations, just because it's going to be fun, even though I know the right answer. And I know you won't be mad about it because you know where it comes from, right? And also, I think the final message should be nice to each other. Don't be a dick. Have fun. Be creative. Thanks for watching. Any last words?
All right. I love you guys. Peace.